any other way. Whatever I have done is because of that feeling. Edward Drummond Libbey was no ordinary man. Most people in our community knew him as a businessman or as a patron of the arts. But few people alive today know who he really was. He was born on April 17, 1854, the only son of William Langdon Libbey, owner of the New England Glass Works. At 19, Edward declined an application to Harvard, preferring instead to enter the family business. His father reluctantly agreed, but assigned Edward to the lowest positions in his firm in the hope that he would prefer college to the dirty work of a glass factory. Instead of being dissuaded, Edward learned the glass business from the bottom up. When older and more experienced men said it couldn't be done, he showed his genius for promotion. He convinced Tiffany's in New York to buy the company's entire inventory of Amberina art glass, an item languishing in his father's warehouse until then. 30 years later, Amberina was still selling well. E.D. Libbey established its selling power in part by his original promotion. When he was 29, his father died, and the business became his responsibility. The company, though well established and respected, was in poor financial shape. Fuel was very expensive in Massachusetts. In 1886 and 87, labor unrest grew. There was a series of strikes. Libbey wanted to come west, where fuel was cheap and raw materials were abundant. Toledo, anxious to have him locate here, welcomed him with open arms in 1888. A brass band played at the station for the many Boston glassworkers who came with him. The mayor and welcoming committee were there to greet him. The newspapers printed articles praising this up-and-coming young man of business. Toledo gave him a free plot of land on which to build his factory. Some say, though, it was really Florence Scott who attracted him to Toledo. While in a local office deciding whether or not to locate here, Libbey saw this attractive, well-dressed young lady walk by. Who was that striking-looking girl, he asked his companion, who had tipped his hat to her. This gentleman, a friend of the Scott family, promptly arranged a dinner engagement for Edward to meet Florence that evening, and they were married 2 years later on June 24th, 1890. But Libbey had a hard 2 years in business before his marriage. His company was doing poorly. Many who followed him from Boston went back home. He considered going back home himself. His dreams of the Golden West were souring. Near despair, he went to Wheeling, West Virginia, to recruit some new men. There, he made one of the most important decisions of his life. He hired Michael J. Owens, a fiery Irishman who was a genius at mechanizing glass-forming processes. "Mr. Libbey," he said, "you'd better hire me. I'll make you a good man." Owens invented a series of glass-making machines which truly revolutionized the glass industry. The Owens bottle machine was just one way Owens made good on his promise to Mr. Libbey. They were business partners and friends for 35 years. Libbey began by producing handmade cut and blown glass. He later automated his operations and expanded his product lines to include lamp chimneys, electric light bulbs, and glass tubing, flat or sheet glass, chemical glassware, and glass-forming machinery. 4 years after his arrival in Toledo, the future of Libbey Glass was looking better. The company made substantial profits on a contract for manufacturing large quantities of light bulbs. A reasonably secure future, however, was not good enough for Libbey. He set his sights on the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. He wanted a grand Libbey pavilion. He wanted visitors to his pavilion to watch the operation of an actual glass factory producing glassware. His company would produce a showpiece, a glass dress. His business associates said no, the company couldn't afford this display. But he was a promoter, an advertising genius, and a courageous man. He got the money he needed, about $250,000 in all. Then, Libbey and his new bride spent a year in Chicago while he personally oversaw the construction of the Libbey Pavilion. The fair opened, and people stayed away in droves. Libbey was disappointed, but undaunted. Always the promoter, Libbey began charging admission to the pavilion. Then he offered visitors one of the small novelty items the pavilion's glass factory was producing. The idea was a smash. The ladies loved the glass dress. Princess Eulalia of Spain ordered one just like it. After the fair, no fashionable woman wanted to be without Libbey cut glassware in her home. It took a remarkable woman to agree to spend the first year of her marriage in the background during construction of her husband's World's Fair pavilion. Florence Scott was a member of a pioneering Toledo family. Her grandfather, Jessup Scott, was an early settler of the city. He acquired much valuable real estate, was a co-owner of the Toledo Blade, and a passionate believer in the future of Toledo. The Scott family donated the lands upon which the Toledo Museum of Art was to be built. The philanthropy of Edward Drummond and Florence Scott Libbey is best exemplified by the Toledo Museum of Art. In 1901, men of the exclusive Tile Club, an arts interest group, had an idea. If Pittsburgh and Chicago could have art museums, why not Toledo? The Tile Club got Mr. Libbey interested. Once again, Mr. Libbey knew his man when he saw him. He persuaded George Stevens to become director of the museum, such as it was, in 1903. Housed first in the Gardner Building, and then in this frame building, the museum's first collection consisted of a painting of sheep, a table and some chairs, and a mummified cat. But George Stevens was not discouraged. Like Libbey, he had the courage to dream on a grand scale. He used his amazing range of talents as actor, musician, speaker, poet, and magician to win support for the dream. Libbey would match the funds George could raise from the community. Stevens campaigned tirelessly, and Edward Libbey gave funds many times over his initial promise. George and Nina Stevens, Arthur Secor, the Libbeys, and others dreamed of a palace of art. In 1912, the dream became a reality. The museum would be like a Greek temple, white, clean, streamlined. It would not be for adults only, like other museums of its day. Children were not only allowed, they were welcomed. They were encouraged to see, experience, learn, enjoy, and try to create for themselves if they wished. Free art and music education for children is just one of the gifts the Libbeys helped give the people of Toledo. Edward Libbey not only produced glass, he collected it as well, and then gave it to the museum. He donated many major works of art. He also bought the work of unknowns. He purchased George Bellows' Blackwell's Bridge long before Bellows achieved wide reputation. Mrs. Libbey personally donated a charming Delftware collection and numerous Oriental art objects. In 1905, the Libbeys became interested in Egypt. They traveled there in search of treasures they could bring back to the museum. The papyrus Libbey was a rare find. It documented the reign of the pharaoh Kabasha and revealed the considerable power Egyptian royal women possessed over their husbands and their money. To this day, a large portion of all the acquisitions made by the Toledo Museum of Art are purchased through use of endowment funds bequested by Mr. and Mrs. Libbey through their wills. The Libbeys spent much of their time in travel abroad, in Italy, France, Germany, Switzerland, Holland, England, and elsewhere in Europe for business and for pleasure. They traveled in the United States as well, particularly in California. In 1917, the Libbeys fell in love with the Ojai Valley area in California and built a winter retreat there. Mr. Libbey, in typical fashion, decided the town of Ojai could use a few things: a Spanish-style shopping arcade, a post office, a public park with music amphitheater, a country club and golf course. Their retreat in Ojai was Shangri-La for Florence and Edward. They possessed fullness of life, but in 1925, at age 72, Edward Drummond Libbey suddenly contracted pneumonia and died within a few days. The city of Toledo mourned him. Flags flew at half-mast. Toledo had lost one of its finest citizens, a man who said he was proud to hail from Toledo. Florence Scott Libbey lived in California until her death in 1938. She carried on the Libbey tradition of giving. She had a great love of music and wanted the art museum to house not only visual art, but live musical performances as well. She also wanted to help ease the burden of unemployment in Toledo during the Depression years. So she gave the funds and directed that the peristyle be built. About 3,000 people were employed to complete this part of the museum in 1933. When she died in 1938, a memorial service was held for her in the peristyle. Edward Drummond Libbey and Florence Scott Libbey believed in giving of their wealth, of their time, in cultural and civic affairs, of their dreams for a more beautiful Toledo. The Libbeys lived with a spirit of giving, and today, Toledo is richer for having known them.